Shall we just begin? I don't know whether the audience is there.
Seem to be dropping in.
Oh, you can see that?
We already have 33.
Okay.
Great. Do you want to start?
Yes.
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Dijkzeul. I'm one of the participants today, but I've been asked to tell a few words about our institute. And our institute has got an acronym. It says IFHV in German, IFHV. In English, it stands for Instituut voor Financieringsrecht und Humanitaires Völkerrecht, which means something like Institute for the International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict. We're an interdisciplinary institute. Max Bertamini, he was working now in the background, is, for example, an international law expert. I try to become an expert in, let's say, the more managerial and sociological aspects of humanitarian crisis. And we are very happy that you're all here. And yeah, without much ado, I would like now to give the floor back to Kilian.
Great. Thank you so much for these introductory words, Dennis, and a warm welcome to both our panelists and the attendees. Thanks for tuning in from wherever you're at, your offices, your homes, and welcome to this roundtable on localizing humanitarian action, promises and pitfalls. And this is actually the first in a mini series of 2 brown bag lunch series on localization and the politics of humanitarian action. I'll say a few words about the second webinar at the end of this session. Thanks to IFHV for hosting this within your humanitarian innovation webinar series. We're really glad to be able to discuss today under your sort of wings. To introduce myself, I'm Kilian Spandler. I'm a researcher at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and I'm co-organizing this event series together with Christina Ropsdorf, who's also at IFHV, and Sulania Maicha at the University College in Dublin. Now, okay, let's get right into it. The humanitarian sector has long been diagnosed with a variety of problems, such as providing ineffective responses, failing to mobilize resources, not being attuned in their responses to the demands of the affected populations, perpetuating dependencies instead of empowering marginalized people, and failing to come to terms with systemic problems like paternalism and racism. At least since the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, many have come to see localization as a cure to many, if not all of these issues. And it's become somewhat of a guiding principle for reforms of the humanitarian sector. Evaluations, however, have found that implementation of this localization agenda is still lagging, and also that these deep-seated problems seem to persist. And there's a growing sense of frustration among many humanitarian practitioners. Degan Ali, the humanitarian leader, 2021, for example, expressed these frustrations, saying, in this sector, we are very good at talking, but we are bad at making change. Now, all of this raises questions like, why is the localization agenda not moving ahead? What political interests are ingrained in debates and practices of localization? And what is the normative value of this localization idea? What alternative concepts need to be taken into account? These questions formed the starting point for a collaborative publication project that Christina, Sulania, and myself launched it was actually in 2020, yeah, and which has now sort of come to a conclusion and is available as a research topic with the title Localization and the Politics of Humanitarian Action in Frontiers in Political Science. I will soon post a link in the chat so that you all have the articles if you're interested in reading them. And 4 of the authors of that research topic are joining us today for the discussion on the panel. I'm really happy that they're all here. And let me briefly introduce them. First, we have Oheneba Boateng, who is a research associate and a Fritz Thyssen Fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. We have Dijkzeul, who is already introduced this session, who's a professor in conflict and organization research at the IFHV. We have Lee Michael Shults, who is hailing from Norway. He's a PhD research fellow at the University of Agder. And finally, we have Dany, who's managing director of the Peace Academy Rhineland-Palatinate, so Rhineland-Pfalz for German speakers, at the University of Koblenz-Landau. Right, so I think we have loads of research expertise on humanitarian action on this roundtable, and I'm really looking forward to kicking off the discussions. Just in terms of housekeeping, we will first have a conversation of around 35 to 40 minutes among the panelists, and then move over to also give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. And Max will probably, if he hasn't already done so, already let you know how you can ask these questions through the Q&A function. Yes. So as a sort of opening round, before we engage in a deeper discussion on localization, I thought we should maybe clarify what we're actually talking about, right? Because there does not really seem to be a consensual, precise definition of the term. Based on your engagement, and we'll do a quick round among the panelists, how would you actually define localization? I'll move ahead and maybe we can start in the order that I just presented you. So Oheneba, you have the floor with a brief attempt at defining localization.
Oh, okay, thanks, Kilian. Well, my experience with the term has always been associated with, it actually came mainly from, regionalism, the studies of regionalism, and it's mainly about how external norms are adapted to a particular local place, right? So the direction is from outside to, inside, if I can put it that way. So if we transport that meaning to localization in humanitarian action, it basically means the adaptation of global humanitarian templates, if you have anything like that, to certain localities, right? So if we have something like whatever global agenda we have at the UN or from other global platforms, how are these agenda then implanted into certain localities where the bulk of humanitarian action takes place, right? So that is what I see as localization, the adaptation of external norms or practices into certain localities.
Great, thanks. Giving the word to Dennis.
Okay. Yeah, because it's a term that you can criticize, but there's a normative ideal in it, especially since it has been formulated within the World Humanitarian Summit, but that the people in need and the organizations they engage in can make their own decisions. So in the background, there's always the ideal of autonomy or self-determination.
Great, thanks. Lee, how would you define localization?
I think if to the extent that we can give sort of a general definition, then the one presented at the beginning is pretty accurate. We're trying to move away from sort of a dominance of international organizations and more towards groups that are closer to the humanitarian situation. I think the big challenge definitionally is case by case, trying to understand what we mean by closer. What senses of proximity are we going to consider more or less legitimate? Because at the level of practice, there are always different groups that are all close to the situation. They have different ideas about how to move forward.
Wonderful. And Charlotte?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, for me, localization is maybe just best described also as an agenda or a vision, something which has been said before. And the idea of this vision, if you want to term it as in this desirable way, is to overcome established donor-receiver relations. And in my piece, I describe localization as a way to integrate solidarity into the humanitarian aid agenda. Because, how does localization enable solidarity? It's because it asks to give up this dichotomous donor-receiver relation, and also it demands to strengthen the agency of the affected people, the so-called locals, in organizing aid to themselves.
Great. So we already have a bunch of different definitions. We have localization as adaptation, as self-determination, as proximity of humanitarian action, and as a kind of transformation of established structures. And I think these different perspectives, as Charlotte already indicated, also reflect your different sort of scholarly ways of engaging with the topic. So I thought that maybe we could do a quick round where each of you could, in 2 sentences, really short, like just so the audience also understands the background from where your perspectives are coming from, explain what your research in the context of this research topic was about, and what your sort of main ideas or arguments, what your main message is in 2 sentences. So Charlotte, you already sort of started, so maybe we can also go back to you directly. Is there anything you would add, or how would you summarize your research?
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, so I had a perspectives article in this special section on localization, which means it was a kind of a brief and very opinionated piece, not so much a research article. And right, so I was thinking about how the COVID pandemic affected the humanitarian aid system. And I basically argued 2 points. And one was that the pandemic somehow showed the requirement to localize aid, the necessity to localize aid, and that also a few steps were taken in that direction. And second, that this these steps or this localization in this regard could infuse solidarity into humanitarian action. Having that said, but I think that's maybe something for the discussion, I also use a lot of the piece actually to say that solidarity and humanitarian aid are two totally different things. So I think we have to discuss what solidarity means.
Mm-hmm. Great. Lee. You just remuted your mic, sorry.
My apologies.
Yeah.
Charlotte's point is an excellent segue into my topic, which was also focused on solidarity. The sort of a 2-second summary that I had prepared was, I wrote, localization and global solidarity are both integral to motivating and responsibly sustaining humanitarian aid. However, they pull in opposite directions, and a lack of balance between the two can have devastating consequences. So I completely agree with Charlotte that we have to talk about both, and they're both important aspects of humanitarian action, but that they are definitely distinct. And as you said, we can get into that discussion in a little bit more depth later.
Fantastic. Dennis.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I'm afraid that I'm going to use 2.5 sentences at least. But no, noticing that localization is actually being talked about, but that its actual implementation is it's not just falling behind, it's not even taking off. Yeah. Yuko Slim, who's going to be here next week, wrote about a stunning failure, and I agree with that. Nevertheless, there are forms of partnership that are doing somewhat better with localization. And I looked at one partnership in both Uganda and South Sudan, where local organizations, and we can talk a lot about what local means, yeah, but organizations that are working on the ground as a shorthand here, we're becoming more self-determined and autonomous. But for that, you need to understand the different aid chain. And this was an aid chain with really long-term partnerships going back decades. They all belong to the Roman Catholic Church, something that I'm sometimes skeptical about, but in this case, it actually worked. And there was enough funding for 3 years, which is not a very long time, but it's better than the half-year or annual funding in many humanitarian funding situations. And one thing that they did was on the basis of evaluations and the South-South cooperation, you had some real learning effects, how the organizations were able to develop capacities and indicate what they wanted from the donor, and then the donor could go along with that. At the same time, I had to notice that both in terms of scale and sustainability, let's say that this example is rather vulnerable. So I made a more empirical study about a relatively successful form of partnership where these organizations became a bit more autonomous. And I also tried to describe that is not necessarily the case, because there are several conditions like long-term funding, building trust, having enough time that need to be fulfilled.
Great. Sorry, just tried in vain to unmute. And Oheneba, your research in a nutshell.
All right, thank you. I mean, by now everybody knows I have a problem with the term localization, because to me it describes a process that's totally irrelevant to what African societies have been trying to do since the 1960s, at least. I agree with the idea of building the structures of humanitarian response on the values and organizations that are created by those who are affected by the disasters themselves, and their governments, if we are talking in political sense. But I think localization is the wrong term to describe it. If we really want to do that, like strengthen the capacities of affected societies, we really have to look at how they organize themselves first, and then help them to organize in that fashion to be independent. For me, what we have as localization now has no end game. I don't know what localization is supposed to achieve, let's say in the next 10, 20 years. What would it look like? Will it ever be, would there be a point where we're going to say, now we've arrived, localization is complete? No, I don't see that in the current debate, right? But for me, even if we agree with the concept of self-sufficient systems for societies that are affected by disasters, it should be based on what they have been doing, and it should be based on the long-term vision that they will get to a point where they will be independent, have enough resources on their own or within their neighborhood. I'm talking a lot more in the African sense now, either within individual state territories or within the sub-region, be able to pull enough resources to respond to disasters, because that is what the individual countries and their regional organizations have been trying to do since the 1960s, right? But the current localization agenda almost automatically disregards these pre-existing structures and processes, and rather prioritizes global templates, which a recent study by UNAP has found that is often quite irrelevant to these African countries, because they always have their own agenda that need to be implemented. The only thing they need from their external partners, right? It's not a new normative framework or new normative structures, but the kind of resources that they will need to push their processes to a certain point where they will be self-sufficient, right? So I have a problem with the term localization, because it distracts from what I believe are the most important issues to African countries.
Thanks for all these summaries. And we can already see that we sort of have two main overarching tracks or guiding questions in those in that research. One is, or maybe three actually. So one is how should we think about localization? How does it relate to different concepts? The other is how do we make it work? And the third, more fundamentally, maybe also critical question is do we actually want it? Do we need it? And what is it supposed to achieve? And is that really desirable? And I think we can save some time for discussing both the how do we make it work, or why has it not worked, and the do we actually, what are maybe the downsides of localization in the discussions today. So let's start with the obstacles of localization. So if we look at the attempts at implementing the localization agenda, we have already heard that it's been stunted, it's been maybe a massive failure. What are, in your views, the main reasons for this failure? And now I think we can basically leave the floor to anyone who would go first. There's no particular order in which we need to go.
Yeah, I mean, I can go first. I think the major problem, as I said previously, is conceptual. The way we are thinking about it is really a problem, because as far as I know, there's no clear vision, for localization, what it's supposed to achieve. Yeah, we know empowering local actors, transferring more resources to them. To what end? How long is this resource transfer going to continue? And what would localization look like when it's done, when it's complete, or would it ever be complete? So I think there are key, fundamental issues that have not been clarified about what localization is supposed to do. And I think because we've not clarified these issues, it's very difficult for everyone to clearly come up with a way to implement it, because we don't even know what it is. So how can we really implement what we don't know? So I think the key, well, at least one of the key obstacles I see is the lingering conceptual issues that we have.
Mm-hmm. Great. Would the others agree that there's no really clear vision of what we actually want to achieve with localization? I saw Dennis already raising his hand.
No, I do think that we should work on, or that we should try to think more clearly on how it can be defined and indeed what an end state would look like. But I do see additional problems, and those are actually the structural north-south factors. Partly that's part of the humanitarian system, but it's also part more generally of our global system. And one of the problem, and then also you should think in terms of states. How are states functioning? Having worked in Afghanistan or in South Sudan, I'm skeptical about state-based solutions, but it doesn't mean that the international solutions necessarily are better. And of course, there are also self-interest within the humanitarian system. With the ideal of more self-determination, more autonomy, ideally the northern organizations should work themselves out of a job. That's easy to pay lip service to, that's difficult to really follow through on. At the moment, those international organizations don't have to worry too much about it, because donors will still fund them, and the local organizations, or the organization, I should say, the organizations on the ground, actually receive far less direct funding. And if we're going to make a change, try to do it via direct funding, but the humanitarian system is not geared towards that, and the international geopolitical system definitely isn't geared toward that.
Yeah. Lee, I think you were about to intervene as well.
Yes, I can jump in. Just to establish the context, which I was sort of looking at this situation, we were analyzing the refugee crisis on the Greek island of Lesbos, and trying to look at volunteers and smaller initiatives that we interpreted as voicing a criticism of some of the larger international organizations and the way that they express attitudes like paternalism or perhaps not recognizing the agency of local groups. But as we looked into this, one of the tensions that I think popped out to me, and which calls for more conceptual clarity, is the extent to which individual volunteers or people who feel motivated to participate in humanitarian action, to come and participate in trying to alleviate the suffering that's being brought on by the refugee situation. There is a tension between the sort of motivation, which we characterized as generated by a sense of global solidarity, where in a sense they're being asked to take something that's distant, something that's far away from them, a situation that doesn't directly affect them, and make it their own, to be motivated enough by something that doesn't affect them directly to give up their sort of safety and resources to go and try to contribute, to sort of say that, no, this isn't just a Greek problem, this is a global problem. But then that motivation that comes from global solidarity crashes with these ideas about localization, because once they arrive, once these people are sort of on the ground, I think one problematic way of looking at localizations is just saying people who are on the ground, as though by already being there, already being a part of contributing to at least attempting to alleviate some of this sort of suffering, that you're a member of this group that has a sense of at least geographic proximity to the crisis. So what we were seeing is that a lot of the locals and a lot of the refugees themselves saw the presence of the volunteers as a bigger problem than the presence of the refugees themselves. So after motivating people to become involved by saying, you need to make this problem your problem, once they arrive, they're suddenly being told, well, don't make this your problem. This isn't your problem. There's someone else who's more central. So there's a tension here between you need to make this about you and don't make it about you. And I think at the individual level, that's a tension that's really difficult for people to navigate, especially considering they don't always have professional experience with these kinds of situations.
Yeah. Charlotte, given that you're working on similar topics, does that resonate with you, what you're finding?
Yeah, a lot of things that have been said resonate somehow with and I've prepared an answer to that question, but I want to respond rather also to what Oheneba said initially, because I think I agree very much. That's also something I miss in the discussion. The question why, what's the purpose of localization? So what's the broader goal or the real, like, what's you call it, end game? And I really like that. And I was thinking and discussing in this piece whether it could be solidarity, if that's like the purpose of localization, if that can be. But when we look at the term solidarity, and here we relate to what Lee just said, I mean, that's of course a very big and also very fuzzy term as well. And I don't know how much it serves us. And if we want to make it useful for the localization debate, I think we have to really think a lot more about what kind of solidarity we mean and what are the tensions also with a humanitarian action to solidarity. Having that said, I also just briefly want to mention what are the barriers, because I mean that was a question, right? So what are the barriers to make localization work? And when I reread my piece on COVID, and I found it a bit optimistic, actually too optimistic probably. Because of course, when we look at what was happening in the last years, maybe there were a lot of calls for solidarity, for example, and a lot of calls also to, give aid and rhetorics about how the pandemic would change donor-receiver relations and flipping international cooperation upside down or whatever. And despite all this rhetorics, we saw quite the opposite. When we look at how states mainly try to protect borders and were more concerned with security of states, also the deteriorating situation of refugees during the pandemic, the vaccine, access to vaccines. I mean, there are a lot of examples here, and I don't think I have to elaborate on that very much. So it's very hard also, even if you know or might know why you're doing it, it's very hard to implement it as well.
Can I come in?
Of course.
Yeah, just going back a little bit to what Dany said earlier about his apprehension with state-based solutions, right? And he gave the examples of, I think, Afghanistan and South Sudan, you know. And in a way, I agree that when like states are at war or involved in conflict, they are not in the best position to, again, like deliver, you know, assistance and protection to those individuals that are affected. But at the same time, what I've noticed in these localization debates, especially when they're talking about the lack of capacity, will, and whatever of affected states to lead the process, there's always the tendency to pick the most extreme examples, you know, to ask cases why we shouldn't let states lead the process, you know. But there are several other very good examples where states have led the process and achieving very good results and are, you know, making a claim for their independence, right? And it goes to a point that I made in my paper that we shouldn't expect all the states to achieve that level of self-sufficient at once, because they live in different political systems and different environments that eventually shape how the domestic response systems will evolve. But there are already good examples that can be supported to the level where they can be self-sufficient to, you know, respond to their own disasters. And those that lag behind would need more time, you know. So I think we should be very careful not to kind of generalize that all affected, you know, states, they don't have the capacity to you know, or we can't trust them to protect the vulnerable populations. The second point, which also came from that, is that I agree with him and want to expound on the structural factors that limit this process of, you know, localization. And I made a little point in my paper about our tendency, the humanitarian sector, to compartmentalize issues. You know, as this one is just a humanitarian issue, we don't mix it with politics, you know, to separate the issues from one another. But I think that is dangerous because everything is connected. You know, we are here talking about localization, and I think for me this is mainly because African countries, at least which I'm more familiar with, lack the financial resources. They don't lack the normative structures. They don't lack the organizational ideas. It's just the finances that they lack, you know. So for me, the issue is really about financial autonomy, not necessarily about learning new ways of organizing or learning new ways of thinking about humanity or learning new ways of helping people. African societies know this already. The issue is about, in very simple terms, money, right? Now, so for me, one way I think about localization, when I think about the constraints, is to really think about what prevents, you know, African states from generating enough resources on their own. You know? And there are several issues. You can talk about corruption, you can talk about weak economies and all that. But I came across a very interesting paper, I think, over the past 2 weeks. One was from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and the other one was from the UNCTAD, right? The UN Trade, I've forgotten the full name. But they're making the same point about the connection between capital flight and social spending in Africa, right? And from the bottom line is that social spending is already low on the continent. But the UN study found that about 30 countries in Africa that have, from the period of 1970 to 2010, have lost a total of $2 trillion through capital flight. And over the period, despite the general, you know, really low social spending on the continent, these 30 countries have spent 25% less, you know, on social spending, even below the average for many for the entire continent, right? And their conclusion is that there is a connection between the amount of money that a country has and how much it spends on social, issues. And in many African countries, a lot of the social spending goes to people who suffer floods and other disease outbreaks and other, forms of disasters, right? So this is just a tiny example to make the big point that there are, structural factors that limit the ability of African countries to generate, enough resources, to take care of their own issues, right? So for me, localization is not really about teaching Africans new values or new things, really. It's about making sure that the structures that prevent a lot of countries, we can talk about trade, we can talk, I will not go there, but you know these things. Mm. So what are the limitations that, prevent African countries from, again, generating their own resources? I think we should also consider those factors.
Yeah, thanks for bringing attention to these broader institutional and structural factors. I think they're extremely important, and it also makes sense to maybe already bring in some voices from the audience, because I think one side is as you correctly mentioned, sort of the financial, economic side as to how can local actors achieve financial autonomy. And then there's also the broader question of, one participant asked, who's talking about localization anyway, right? So I think what's alluded to here is also who is where does this discourse of localization come from in the first place? Who is sort of exercising epistemological power, whose knowledge is valued, and so on. If any of you want to speak to these questions as well, that would be appreciated.
I'd be happy to jump in there. Well, one of the things that I talked about with my co-authors, the contribution to the special issue, was the whether or not we should give a sort of epistemic privilege to people that are more affected by humanitarian crises. I think you can certainly talk about that in a more structural or a more financially based way. I think those are really valuable points. But I do think it's also important to look at that from the context of individuals as well, and trying to understand sort of the dynamics with which people are sort of individually affected and how they coordinate, how they engage in different sort of relationships with each other. I think the point about epistemic authority applies to both situations, both in the sense that, well, for example, going back to the idea of self-sufficiency, obviously that is a good goal, but to the extent, building on the point about self-sufficiency, that there are structural factors that stop certain groups who are perhaps most affected or closest to humanitarian situations from being able to attain self-sufficiency. The fact that they have to ask for outside help, or that they require some sort of humanitarian aid or global solidarity, or however we want to conceptualize it, shouldn't mean that as other agents get to come in, then their sort of epistemic authority is taken away from them. Because of the temporary nature of the types of aid and the types of support that these outside agents are able to provide, there is some sort of authority or privilege, or however we might want to categorize it, that does need to remain with the locals, including a broad sense of locality, where we're taking different affected groups into consideration.
How this how realistic do you think that would be? And I'm asking this because from donor states to UN agencies to individual INGOs, everybody is interested in their own survival and visibility, right? So I'm wondering the extent to which they would be willing to kind of just give resources, right? But without any, without trying to control the narrative, because, control of the narrative is actually a very powerful way to, dominate the field, and that has been the history. So I'm wondering if they will be able to kind of separate the two, and step, like just give resources and step back.
Absolutely, it's an incredibly demanding thing to ask, and possibly unreasonable to the extent that we should be pessimistic about the possibility of achieving it. But at least to the extent that I found that relevant in the context that we were looking at, one of the major problems that was expressed by in some of the interviews with the Greek locals and the Greek government officials is talking about how the volunteers would come in order to generate funds to continue their volunteering. They would present images on social media of people, in really traumatic situations. So one possibility is to maybe give the most affected groups more control over the way that the situation is presented, which I referred to as localizing the call for global solidarity. Because when that happens on, whether we kind of want to call it Western terms or the terms of the global North, to sort of generate attention elsewhere, I think the message gets diluted and can be harmful. But I do think it's really difficult. I mean, again, my focus was more on the individual level, but we get back to that sort of tension that I was talking about earlier, where on the one hand, it requires an enormous amount of energy to put yourself into this situation, and there will inevitably be really powerful sort of transformations going on, which are valuable. But those transformative experiences can't lead people to taking an inappropriate degree of ownership. I think at the level of volunteers, it's maybe more possible to be optimistic because their agenda is in a sense their own, of course influenced by structural factors, but at least in the way that they express their projects, they're going to try and help. They're in a sense, at least the way they describe themselves, or they perceive themselves, they're trying to help people affected on their own terms. So to the extent that we can show that they're not actually successfully doing that, when they take ownership over the situation. One distinction that I really liked, there's an article by Ashley Taylor where she distinguishes between robust solidarity and expressional solidarity, where robust solidarity is something that holds between members of an affected in-group, whereas expressional solidarity is sort of the parallel interests of concerned out-groups. And in both situations, she talks about how in solidarity, the well-being of the people most affected becomes central to your sense of well-being. But in the case of expressional solidarity, the commitment is unidirectional. So you can make the well-being of a group that's in crisis incredibly central to your sense of who you are. But as long as that solidarity is expressional, if it's unidirectional, then it shouldn't warrant a sense of ownership over the situation, or the coordination of the crisis, as well as the representation of the crisis. So I think to the extent that we can highlight that, and especially starting at the individual level, we might be able to make some progress in that direction.
Yeah. Thanks. I like what you said about expressional solidarity, and because that indeed, the rhetoric may be fine, but in the end, the action may be lacking, or actually very disappointed or counterproductive. I going back a bit from the volunteers, but also thinking about the structural conditions. I agree actually, Oheneba, about the what you said, and of course I've worked mainly in Afghanistan, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So that has of course colored my opinions. But what I thought was most important, or what I tried to really make clear in my article, is that even in those circumstances, you do have actors who actually work quite well with the people in need, where there is a type of local accountability, where you can support their autonomy. So the issue with money, I think structural factors are so strong, unfortunately, that there will not be much money coming forward. But we can look empirically which volunteers are functioning in a way that actually makes a positive change, or which organizations operate in an accountable way. And I'm going to give an example now from Afghanistan about a human rights project that I looked at. This was not a human rights project in Kabul. It was Afghans working, local NGOs and local administration, in particular in the educational system. The local NGOs, and I'm using the word local here uncritically, you know, but I could say Afghan NGOs that are active at the village level. Yeah, those NGOs actually were in no way in touch with either the National Ministry of Education or even the teachers. And one of the basic things was establishing such contacts. That was not easy, but actually when it started to work and people started to trust each other, you got this very basic level of accountability that was being established, and it actually worked quite well. Now, that program was being supported by the Dutch, and the Dutch then changed their policies, and you know, this kind of project didn't get more support, unfortunately. I was in The Hague, you know, telling them, look, this really worked well, and they were very happy with it. But even I, as a scholar, you know, then you're not high enough, you don't get in high enough in the hierarchy to make a change in that respect. So I am actually quite positive about many of the opportunities that we have, but they are a lot of hard work. About the money coming in, yeah, unfortunately, there I'm most skeptical.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the audience that we could maybe try to address in the remainder of the session. And I try to connect them somehow to what has already been said. Forgive me if I don't manage to do that very well. But one thing is that, you know, Dennis, you have mentioned a couple of conditions that need to be met in order for localization to work. And here we have one question by Juan Posada. How is the willingness of donors and international NGOs to give power away addressed in this localization approach? How are questions about who sets the rules and standards to decide that Global South political and moral communities are ready to take over humanitarian action addressed? So in other words, who gets to decide when localization is possible or not, and sort of devolution, or however you want to call it?
Shall I give a practical example?
Sure,
Yeah.
Why not? Yeah.
Okay, going to northern Uganda, looking at Caritas Gulu. These people knew Joseph Kony from the Lord's Resistance Army personally, because he once was a catechist in the Roman Catholic Church. This was before, you know, he started the Lord's Resistance Army. You had the bizarre situation that people had been caught in the crossfire between the Lord's Resistance Army and the Ugandan army, and almost got killed, you know, being in crossfire, a healthy place to be, who then later had to negotiate with people from the Lord's Resistance Army, who were partly friends from childhood with then totally changed personalities. Yeah, but they did it, and they essentially asked a German organization, Caritas International, so part of the same family, can you help us? And without many rules attached, Caritas Germany helped them. This is an imperfect example in the sense that they were never able to let the Lord's Resistance Army stop its work. Yeah, but at very least, the local Caritas organization with Ugandan staff was able to improve at least the situation in northern Uganda, and later on for the South Sudanese refugees. What is important in this relation between this German organization and the Ugandan Caritas was that they knew each other so well that there was a lot of trust, and they knew each other over a long period of time. So when you then get a request, we really need to do this, people can act in an unbureaucratic way. The thing I'm most skeptical about is, how can we scale this up? Yeah, where would we have a situation that the German government, the Dutch government would say, oh, we just got something from northern Nigeria, let's not attach too many strings. If you then go to the parliament, whether it's the right-wing populist, once again in either Germany or the Netherlands or whatever country, and they say, you gave away money with no strings attached, and I can see the headlines the next morning. Yeah, so but at the same time, good things are really possible. And so I want to stress both, but you need time and trust. The hard part is, and this, where I would like to learn from you guys, how can we scale it up?
Charlotte, you also wanted to speak on that point.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question as well, because that's also something I think we missed out in the discussion here, and maybe also in the broader discussion on localization. What does that mean for the international organization, the traditional humanitarians? So so to say, how will their role change? And it's clear that their role must change, and but it's not really clear what that means. I do think that, thanks Dennis for this practical example. I don't have a practical example, but I've studied international, like the way international humanitarian organizations changed over the last decades, and especially during also the so-called refugee crisis. And we had a few examples in the discussion already on that example here. Localization in the sense of giving responsibility away somehow to other actors, those more closely to the crisis or those affected by the crisis, means for some international NGOs that they have the possibility to do something else, which might be supportive to this agenda, but it's not directly linked. An example from the refugee crisis would be Doctors Without Borders, for example, and many other international NGOs that became much more involved in political advocacy than usual. They stepped out from certain contexts where they would provide aid and instead made campaigns, engaged more in negotiating or being more adversarial towards EU institutions, for example. And I think this political role can be stepped up and should be. I mean, that's my opinion. And that may be an answer to the question, what happens to the internationals then?
Thank you. There are 5 more minutes. We can use this opportunity to bring in another question from Sara Torreyes Vives. It's a pretty long question, so I'm just going to take the final point here. An important point to discuss, I think, is who does the localization agenda resonate with? In my experience, localization is seen mostly as a Western term that has now permeated the field and at times has been used to perpetuate / justify ways of working that just continue to exacerbate inequality and white saviorism. And I think what that does is bring the question back to, is there a way in which talking about localization, and it is partly, at least partly, or in very important ways, a global North discourse, actually does more harm than it does good?
I mean, what? Oh, Dennis, go ahead.
If you want to go, Oheneba.
Okay. So one study I came across from UNAP, I think I referenced that earlier. They conducted research in Ethiopia and I've forgotten the other country, but in both countries, they found that the localization agenda is actually not that relevant to those contexts. And one of the conclusions was that global agenda tend to overestimate their relevance in these settings. Right? And I think that comes from the fact that there's not, maybe it's changing, I hope, at least in academia, and I hope in humanitarian organizations as well. But for a long time, there's not been that sort of reflection within the global North, especially on what debates that start here could be missing, because there's been a long tradition of a lot of people feeling self-content that we have the knowledge, we know everything, and now it is up to us to transfer that to you, and it's up to you to receive them. So when you operate from this orientation, it's very difficult for you to really be open to suggestions, even from those that are affected, by disaster. So I think there should be hopefully what we're seeing now would continue, where organizations and researchers are becoming more critical of themselves and more reflective on the ideas they put out there. But even to go beyond that, there should be that kind of, proactive effort to really engage alternative, sometimes even contradictory ideas from other sources, because whether the idea is positive, you consider it positive or negative, the point is you learn from it, and you expand, you expand your understanding of the issue that you're dealing with. So that we should do a lot more to really go outside of our comfort zone. I'm currently, finishing a book that, writes the history of the humanitarian system from the perspective of African agency. And what I discover from African principles of humanitarian action, which actually included specific ones to regulate the behaviors of the UN and other international organizations, to certain limits on which organizations can operate in certain areas, to really a way of thinking about the connection between humanitarian action and long-term development, and setting a timeline on when they want to eliminate, and that's the word they use, eliminate the refugee issue from Africa, for example. But it's what I'm writing on gives me a totally different view of the kind of history that I've received from mainstream, accounts, right? So for us to really push beyond the boundaries that we've lived in for decades, we really need to engage other cultures, of humanitarianism, cultures where they practice on their own version of helping one another, helping people that are in need. But at the same time, let's also engage them on how they even understand their role in this now globalized system.
Yeah. And I think I can speak for many of us that we can't wait to read that book. Unfortunately, I got the signal from the organizers that we need to finish on time. So it's now my duty, although I hate to do it, but to wrap up the discussions. Thank you all so much for your great insights. I think we will take up where we're leaving today soon, namely on the 7th of February, with the second brown bag lunch on localization. If you have registered for this webinar, then you will be automatically registered also for the second one. So we're really looking forward to seeing you all again, then with another set of authors, hopefully another set of great discussions. Thank you all for the input, also from the audience. If you're interested, one final little pointer to the research topic itself. I sent the link through the chat. You can find it also by Googling localization and the politics of humanitarian action. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a nice day, morning, evening, depending on where you're hailing from.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.